Who was the Mets' most valuable player in 2022? We'll discuss that on this edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, going through the Mets season and trying to find who the most valuable player is not an exact science. If we wanted to make it one, there's a very simple way to do it. Look at Fangraphs wins above replacement. Francisco Lindor, 6.8 F4, most valuable Met, end of conversation. But there's no nuance to that. And as much as I think Francisco Lindor is squarely in the running, and that is the easiest argument to make to say, look, combine offense and defense, what he has done as the Gold Glove caliber shortstop anchoring a really good Mets defense, what he did as a run producer, driving in 107 runs, stealing 16 bases, scoring 98 runs, 107 RBIs, as I said. I mean, there's so many different ways to look at Lindor's production and say he was the guy, but I think that there's more to it than that, because Pete Alonso, if we go strictly on an F4 conversation, because he struggled a bit defensively this year, because when you look at his WAR value and how much it was taken away from based on that defense, that he has a 4F4 that says that Brandon Nimmo is a more valuable player this year, it doesn't exactly add up to what I think is the exact value of a player. And if we're to look at who's going to get the most MVP votes this year, I think it could go to either Lindor or Alonso. I think there's a chance that both of them end up in the top 10 in MVP voting. So those are the guys that get the most recognition. But then you also look at a Jeff McNeil, and he's been very valuable. And I think he has a sneaky case to be the most valuable Met this past season. So what I wanted to do is just simply take kind of a macro view of this and just look at the entire team, because what you see is there's 7 qualified players on the Mets this year. Had enough at bats to be qualified. Now, looking through them, each of these guys ended up with a good season. Eduardo Escobar was the one where you could say it was looking like a bad season for a majority of the year, but he carried the team in September and really brought up his season numbers to a respectable place where he hit 20 home runs. He drove in 69, which is really nice. 58 runs scored. His average of 240 was not bad, about where you'd expect Escobar to be. On base percentage, a tad low, but he's never been a high OBP guy. So at 295, you're okay with that, so to speak. 430 slug, maybe a little bit lower than you'd like, but still, he nets out as a 106 WRC plus player, which again measures hitters based on a league average of 100, so 6% better than your league average player at basically $10 million. That's generally what he was getting paid to be, a slightly above average, player for the Mets who could hit some home runs, and with 20 bombs, he was third on the team. So you look at his 2.3 F4, you look at the fact that he played relatively solid defense at third base, and he was, by the end of the season, a net positive offensively, and it wasn't a bad year for Escobar. And you look at Mark Canha, and while I still think that this offseason, that's a spot that the Mets are going to have to really think about. Do they need to get more power out in left field? Can Canha continue to be an everyday player for you, and will that lead to success? These are questions that I think we have, but at the end of the day, even though he only hit 13 home runs, he still scored 71, still drove in 61, still walked at an 8.9% clip, which is respectable, struck out at less than a 20% clip at 17.9%, which just shows you the great at-bats that he gave the Mets, game after game after game. He had hot months and cold months, but still was productive. Hit 266, 367 on base, 403 slugging, a 128 WRC plus, means he was 28% better than your league average hitter, and a 2.8 F4. I mean, it was a strong season. It wasn't a most valuable season as far as Mets players, but my point more is another above average contributor. Starling Marte in 118 games accumulated a 3.0 F4. If he was able to play a full 150 even, you're probably talking about at least your fifth 4+ win player, if not ranging closer towards a 4.5 to a 5-win player. I think if he was on the field a little bit more, he might have been more productive as well. He had to deal with some stops and starts throughout his season, but altogether still hit 16 homers, which was tie with Nimmo for the 4th best mark on the team. He scored 76 runs. That was good. 63 RBIs, 18 stolen bases to lead the team. Hit 292, which was the best average outside of Jeff McNeil. 347 on base, 468 slugging, a 136 WRC plus, which puts him right behind Jeff McNeil and Pete Alonso for the 3rd best mark on the team. And again, I already mentioned his F4 of 3. And also, his defense actually took away from his F4 based on Fangraphs metrics. I think there was a learning curve at the beginning of the season where there was a couple plays he didn't make that really dragged down his metrics, but we watched him play a really strong right field out there. So he was definitely a very strong player. He was an all-star and someone that I think moving forward you trust is going to have another big season next year. But you get to kind of the core 4 of the team this year, which was Lindor, McNeil, Nimmo, and Alonso. And if you look at the show sheet on YouTube today on the side there, I didn't include Nimmo as one of the 3 candidates, but you certainly can make an argument for him based on F4 5.4, the fact that he played really strong defense in center field at premium position. He hit 274, 367 on base, 433 slugging, a 134 WRC plus, so 34% better than your league average player while playing that strong defense at a premium position. So that's really impressive. Scored more runs than anyone else on the Mets at 102, 64 RBIs, the 16 home runs, as I mentioned, tying Marte. Stole a couple bases down the stretch of the season, but Nimmo is a really good player, and I think moving forward, he's the only piece here that we're not sure if it's going to be back next year, and that's a big piece to potentially lose. So the question here, as we've already discussed this offseason, is what do you do with Brandon Nimmo as it relates to your team next season? If you lose him, you're going to have to replace him, but that's the thing that I wanted to start off the show with today as we try to evaluate who's the most valuable Met. We're going to get into the top 3 candidates in a minute here. They did have 7 above average regulars, and that's not easy to have. I mean, there's not a lot of teams that can say that they had 7 spots in the lineup that was filled by an above average player. The Mets did that. And if you go based on WRC plus, all of them above average offensively, and even further than that, outside of Escobar, all of them at least a 127 WRC plus, and the lowest of those top 6, shockingly, Francisco Lindor, a point behind Mark Canha, and about 16 points below the leader in Pete Alonso and Jeff McNeil. So we're going to discuss the top 3 in just a minute here, because the Mets had some incredible players with incredible performances this season that I want to dive into a little bit further, as Jeff McNeil, Francisco Lindor, and Pete Alonso just put together great season. Before we get to that, though, BetOnline.net is your #1 source for all of your football betting info this season. Find the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. We now know the World Series is set. Phillies versus Astros. Astros a heavy favorite, but you never know with those Phillies. If you want to maybe hedge your happiness a bit as you're rooting against the Phillies, maybe lay something on the Phillies. So if they win, you cash out. If they lose, guess what? The Phillies lost the World Series. We're all happy. It is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action. Bet online, where the game starts. Now we look at the top 3 players on the Mets this season: Francisco Lindor, Jeff McNeil, and Pete Alonso. And Lindor has the best case based on, again, Fangraphs wins above replacement, as 6.8 F4 season was ridiculously strong for Francisco Lindor. And just looking around the league at where that ended up ranking, he was the 6th most valuable player based on F4 this season, behind Freddie Freeman, Paul Goldschmidt, Nolan Arenado, Manny Machado, and Aaron Judge. You have to scroll down a bit before you get to Jeff McNeil at 5.9. He was a top 20 player based on wins above replacement this season at 16th. And then Nimmo was the 21st best player in baseball, actually tied with Julio Rodriguez of the Mariners, who did play in 19 less games than Nimmo to accumulate that same 5.4 F4. So the Mets had some valuable guys, but I want to take this beyond simply looking at that one metric, that one stat, and look at the composite of their season. And I think if you're talking about value, the fact that Francisco Lindor and Pete Alonso were both on the field for nearly every game this year. For Lindor, all but one, the game after he slammed his finger in the hotel room door. And for Alonso, 2 games. I think it was also a finger injury, I believe, when he got hit in the hand by a pitch, if I'm not mistaken. And then the last game of the season, he was rested. So those 2 guys were out there every single day for a team that won 101 games. Every single series that was important, they were out there. Now, Jeff McNeil, to his credit, was still healthy and played 148 games, so I'm not going to knock him entirely for that. But, you look at the at-bats, and Lindor was at 706, or plate appearances, to lead the team. Alonso at 685 to be second on the team. McNeil all the way down at 589, so he just didn't get as much run as those other 2 guys. Now, in some respects, that hurt him a bit because maybe Jeff McNeil gets the extra 100 plate appearances, and part of that was because he was batting low in the lineup at times. Maybe he would have produced, he definitely, in my opinion, would have at least been a 6 F4 player because he's at 5.9 without those extra plate appearances. But here's a guy that hit 326, that won a batting title, that had a 382 on base percentage, a 454 slugging percentage, was great on defense, but also played multiple positions. I talked last week about how he was snubbed from the utility gold glove. Look, Jeff McNeil, in my opinion, and maybe I'm biased because I went into this season really laying it thick on Jeff McNeil and betting on a bounce-back season, and he made me look really good. But at the same time, I've always loved his game. I love the fact that he only strikes out at a 10.4% clip, that he goes out, that he plays his ass off every single time, that he makes incredible defensive plays at second, right field, left field, wherever you put him. And that utility has allowed for lineup flexibility for Buck Showalter. And you discuss also where he hit in the lineup, the fact that he could be a great 8-hitter for the Mets at certain points of the season, which is probably a mistake, but I'm okay with it. It worked out. He was fantastic wherever you put him. When he was in the 3-hole, he was strong. He's a guy that you can really hit anywhere. I think moving forward, there is an argument for Jeff McNeil to be your 3-hitter, which would bump Lindor from that spot. But, you look at their offensive production this season, while Lindor gives you the pop, I like Jeff McNeil in front of Pete Alonso some way, shape, or form. Maybe he should be your 2-hitter. Maybe he should be your leadoff guy if Nimmo walks, which is certainly an argument to be made considering the fact that he led the team in on-base percentage. So that makes a lot of sense. But the Mets need to make sure that Jeff McNeil gets more plate appearances next season because, based on the numbers here, the only player that was more valuable offensively, and it was by a hair, was Pete Alonso. You look at WRC Plus, which measures hitters based on that league average of 100. Once again, an identical mark at 143. In their first All-Star season in 2019, it was identical at 142. So they've had this habit. Or maybe it was 144. Let me check that and make sure I gave you the right number. Not that it matters. It's 2 points one way or the other. But now there's something in my head that's telling me it was, it's 144 actually from 2019. But the point remains the same. Those 2 guys were your 2 most valuable offensive players this year. And while Alonso drove in 131, the at-bats you were getting from McNeil, because he gets on base, an additional 30% of the time than Alonso does, and he hits for a higher average, over 50 points better. There is that value there that McNeil still brings. But with that said, you put runs on the board, you win baseball games. And no one was better at putting runs on the board this season than Pete Alonso. 40 home runs to lead the team, 131 RBIs. It's really tough for me to make this decision who I believe is the most valuable. And I'm very curious in the comment section on YouTube if you guys want to pick who you believe was the most valuable. Was it Lindor, McNeil, or Alonso? I'm a little bit torn. The defense really does edge Lindor. The offense edges Alonso. But Jeff McNeil is almost a happy medium between the two. And because of the way that Buck Showalter was able to deploy him in right field at the end of the season when Marte was out, or in left field at stretches this season, the fact that you could have that great double play combination that formed with him and Lindor. He just filled so many different facets of what the Mets needed and went out and won a batting title that I actually am crazy enough maybe to suggest that Jeff McNeil was the most valuable Met in 2022. But the question is, in 2023, is it going to be one of these three guys again who's the most valuable? Or can they add a player that will be more valuable than these guys? I'll discuss that in just a minute, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. So who will be the most valuable Met in 2023? Will it be Jeff McNeil? Will it be Pete Alonso? Will it be Francisco Lindor? Or will it be somebody not on the board, whether that be a Brandon Nimmo returning, whether that's Starling Marte, or if the Mets go outside the organization this year and add some players, or even internal growth from a prospect? Could Francisco Alvarez stun us as a rookie and be the most valuable player on the Mets? Could Brett Beatty do the same thing? I look at the team next year and what they could do this offseason. And look, we will discuss Aaron Judge and Shohei Ohtani this offseason. Don't think I'm going to do it this week, but I'll likely touch on that next week. Because, yes, those are the two best players that could theoretically change teams this offseason. With that said, the Mets had talked so much about sustainability and building long-term success. To mortgage the farm and to trade for Shohei Ohtani, we're going to have to give up Alvarez and or Beatty, plus a lot, for a guy that could be a free agent in a year. Doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Aaron Judge, after the game yesterday, while I saw Andy Martino today reporting that no one knows what's happening with Judge, I find it a little bit interesting that when he was asked a question about losing that game, he said, it's going to be that much sweeter when we end up, making it through it and reaching, that place that you want to get, that mountaintop. Sounds to me like a player that's expecting to stay. So, again, we'll touch on those guys next week, and if either of them wasn't Met next season, they would be the odds-on favorite to be the Mets' most valuable player, but I don't think you can count on that, and with that said, I just don't see the trade that's out there that really nets you a player better than Pete Alonso or Francisco Lindor or even Jeff McNeil. And, you don't have many holes to fill. You could have a hole at DH, but you already have a couple internal candidates, whether that be Daniel Vogelbach or Mark Vientos or a combination of the two. You still have Brett Beatty, who might factor in at DH or third base, depending on what you do with Escobar. Escobar could also factor into the DH conversation. So while I think the Mets could sign a Michael Conforto to sort of get at bats at DH and left field, or they could, go out and get a Jose Abreu to be the DH and just take over that position, and then either you trade Daniel Vogelbach or you keep him. I don't know exactly what you do there, but there are options that the Mets could pursue this offseason at DH. I don't see any of those DH candidates suddenly coming in and being a more valuable player than Lindor, McNeil, or Alonso. And then, when it comes to replacing Brandon Nimmo, if it's not Nimmo returning, I just don't see any outfielder outside of Aaron Judge, who again is extraordinarily unlikely to come here, to be able to be more valuable than your top three guys. So it gets back to McNeil, Alonso, and Lindor. And while Jeff McNeil, I believe, maybe was the most valuable this season, I don't think that he should be your most valuable player if you're going to be a team that's going to win the division and go on to win a World Series. I think that he should be one of your best players, but there's somebody that has to step up, and the ceiling based on the home run power that Lindor and Alonso provide gives them that edge. Francisco Lindor just had very arguably the best season a shortstop has ever had in franchise history, and I'm probably teasing a future podcast because we will discuss that at some point. Pete Alonso has a chance to go down as the greatest slugger in Mets history. He's already trending very clearly in that direction. Next year, you can see either of them having that type of a season. For Lindor, I think it's tapping into a little bit more pop while having a more consistent play at shortstop. And with that, I just mean he got off to a dreadful start the first month of the year and then sort of dug himself out of that hole all season long. I like to see Lindor start off strong and have a Gold Glove season where he's finally rewarded, although I have my gripes about how they actually do come to terms with who wins that award in particular. But I think there's a lot of room for improvement as far as the home runs go, where I think he could certainly hit 35 bombs in a season, and that would take him to a whole nother level where he could be a 7, 8 F4 type player. And based on F4, he's always likely to be the most valuable Met. Now, what Alonso has to do is not be bad at first. And this year, unfortunately, based on the metrics, he wasn't great. If he's able to clean up that defense a little bit and get himself back to at least slightly above average, the offense will play up more, and he could certainly be the most valuable Met next season. And look, we just saw Aaron Judge hit 63 home runs here. I'm not saying Alonso definitely could get to that point. That's a ridiculous ask. It's historic what Judge did, but I don't think it's shocking or out of the realm of possibility to suggest that Pete Alonso could hit 50 in a season. And if he plays at least average, if not slightly above average defense at first base and hits 50 tanks, it's going to be hard to find a more valuable Met next year. So all these guys really need to once again have great seasons for the Mets to get where they want to go, because again, there's not a lot of room for improvement on this lineup elsewhere, having Marte, Escobar, and Canna all locked into contracts, where I think they are good, solid players for you, but they aren't the MVP types. I think that you could see Lindor go out and, if not win an MVP, be squarely in that top 5 conversation again. I think Jeff McNeil can win another batting title and a Gold Glove, as well as a Silver Slugger. I think all that's on the table for him in the future. And I think Pete Alonso certainly has the chance to be the best run producer in baseball on any given season. And with those 3 guys, the Mets are in pretty good shape moving into next season, regardless of what else they do this offseason. That's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. That way you can check out tomorrow's show, where I'll break down the pitching from this season. Who was the most valuable pitcher? Was it Jacob deGrom? Not much time there. Was it Max Scherzer in his also brief time because he missed some starts? 20 on the year, not quite getting to the 30 plus you would have liked. Edwin Diaz as the closer, or is it someone surprising off the board like a Chris Bassett, who at least stayed healthy all year and took the ball every 5th day? We'll discuss all that tomorrow, but as always, thank you for making this your first listen. And for your second listen today, check out Locked On MLB, hosted by Paul Francis Sullivan. Locked On MLB is where you want to go to stay up to date with everything going on in Major League Baseball. You can follow Locked On MLB wherever you get podcasts.